Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at one United Nations agency that's working to help empower women, because we all know that women are critical. Every family, every society in the world, women are the epicenter. My guest today is an expert on this empowerment. My guest today is Meg Jones. Meg Jones is the chief of the Economic Empowerment section at United Nations Women. Meg, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into empowering women in just a minute because we're all interested in that. Let's talk a little bit about the United Nations Women. When was this agency formed? Why was it formed? What's its, briefly, its major mission?
So the United Nations entity for gender equality in the advancement of women was established in 2010 by the General Assembly. It was part of the reform process when there was a need to, the member states foresaw a need to concentrate the human and financial resources for greater impact. And so UN Women, as it's called today, was born.
And there it is. And that was also a merger, as I recall, of several UN women-related programs in the UN system. So it really was a streamlining and sort of making it more productive and eliminating some duplication of services. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I think most people are familiar with UNIFEM. That was one of the entities which was merged. There was also the Division for the Advancement of Women, the Office for the Special Advisor on Gender and the Advancement of Women, and then the Research Institute that's located in Santo Domingo, which is now, all of these are now a part of UN Women, which is headed, as you know, by Fumzile Mlambo-Nyuka. She's our Executive Director.
Now, what exactly do you do in your, as chief of the Economic Empowerment section? What do you focus on?
Well, you know, the advancement of women is basically through policies, through legislation, through global norms. And so we have projects and programs around that. We have 5 major programs at the moment, 3 what we call flagship programs, 2 pipeline programs. One of them is on climate resilient agriculture. We have another on energy. We have another one on social protection and decent work. We have another on entrepreneurship, and a 5th on the virtual skills school that we're developing now. The thinking behind that was UN Women staff got together and considered how are we going to actually advance the economic empowerment of women. So we thought about what does that boil down to. So when you think about it, you're either employed, and as an employee we're promoting decent work and social protection, or most jobs these days are actually 80% of jobs are people are working for small and medium-sized enterprises. So entrepreneurship is a critical part of this as well. So we're looking at entrepreneurship on the one hand, decent work on the other. We're recognizing that most women work in agriculture, so therefore the program on climate resilient agriculture. The horizons include sustainable energy. And then we realized also that in order for women to succeed, we need to build the capacity of women, hence the virtual skills school, which I'd be delighted to go into in more detail.
We will get there.
I'm sure we
will get there, yes. Well, there are 2 websites I want to be sure to get out for our viewers who'd like to tap in to get more information. One is www.empowerwomen.org, and that ties more directly into what you're doing, but also they can go to www.unwomen.org and to get a broader overview of UN Women and what you're about. There's one concept that we really need to throw out on the table right at the very beginning. I think we're going to hear a lot about. We've heard a lot about it for the last 2 years, and we'll hear more about it for the next 13 years, and those are the Sustainable Development Goals.
Exactly.
Just very briefly, what is the concept behind the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, as you know, Bill, it is about tackling poverty. It's about eliminating poverty in all its forms everywhere. That's actually goal number 1. And then we move through goals about basically tackling injustice and inequality as well, which is a big part of UN Women's work. Goal 5 is about advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. I think most of your viewers would be familiar with that. But what's often forgotten is that in addition to a standalone goal on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, gender equality needs to be a part of all the goals. It's basically what we call a cross-cutting issue in order to realize all of the goals. And so in that context, the Secretary General was interested in ensuring, he recognized that we won't be able to get any traction on tackling environmental issues, for example, unless we address gender equalities in that context. So he put together a high-level panel on women's economic empowerment to basically look at what are the drivers of economic empowerment and how can we ensure we mobilize not only the member states, but also corporations and civil society to tackle and work on those very important areas as well.
And these Sustainable Development Goals are really very critical. They're really all-encompassing. You come right down to it. We won't go through all 17 of them, but they were adopted, I believe, in 2015 by the 193 countries of the United Nations General Assembly. And of course, so many faith-based groups, service clubs such as Rotary International, Lions, Kiwanis, different groups like that, have picked up some of the goals that are supporting them, because these are goals to help, really to help create a better world. And it's critical that people, I think, focus on these Sustainable Development Goals and Google them, or they can go to un.org and learn more about them. But we're going to be hearing a lot more about how we need to eliminate poverty, how to eliminate hunger, to empower women, to provide universal education, or enhanced education, quality education is what I'm getting at, to combating climate change. And these are just laudable goals that we all need to focus upon. And you're absolutely right. Women, they are cross-cutting. They play, it goes from one to another. You can have climate change. Women play a key role. They're affected by climate change, as we all are. So it's absolutely vital to bring women into this discussion.
That's true, Bill. And I think one thing that your viewers may not be aware of is the difference between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Previously, the onus was largely on developing countries to implement and report on the progress on the Millennium Development Goals. The difference about the Sustainable Development Goals, or one of the differences, is that it's actually all member states are reporting on progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's not just about member states. It is about it's a universal agenda. So it's an agenda for corporations as well. Need to be considering what they're doing to advance gender equality and women's empowerment, for example, and for civil society also, who have a strong role to play in that space.
Now, we were talking, well, you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals. Let me just flash back to those. Those were created in 2000. They were in 2000 to 2015, 15-year span of time. They were logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to provide universal primary school education, to empower women, again, to get back into that. And now the Sustainable Development Goals are building on those, and we're going to move forward in this area. You mentioned the Secretary General, I want to make sure I get it right, Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. What exactly, what was this panel, what is it going to do, what did it do, what is it going to do?
Okay, so basically it was about galvanizing action in support of gender equality and women's empowerment, and with strong links to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Secretary General invited the President of Costa Rica to co-chair the panel with the CEO of IKEA Switzerland. So you've got a member state and corporate heading the panel. The panelists included our Executive Director, Jim Kim from the World Bank, Christine Lagarde from the IMF. Also strong representation from civil society. We had ITUC on there, and we had...
who's ITUC?
Oh, that's the International Trade Union Confederation. We had them on the panel as well. SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, which looks after the interests of women in the informal sector. And we had We Connect International, which is looking at increasing spending by corporations on sourcing goods and services from companies owned by women. So the panelists really were represented a broad cross-section of society, because the Secretary General wanted insights into how we can empower women. So the panel conducted research on, or looked at the research that's out there on what works for women and how can we ensure that those best practices are promulgated. And unsurprisingly, there were areas in there like the need to recognise and redistribute unpaid care work, for example, that women are they've used so much to do.
That's right.
How can you actually leave the home and work when
Good question.
have a disproportionate burden of that, looking after the children, the elderly. And so there are recommendations in there about not only what men can do in the home and others can do in the home, but also about state responsibility for ensuring social protection, for example, for redress for women, so that they can actually free themselves up in their time to actually participate more in the paid workforce. But also, I think one of the areas that the panel looked at, which was truly interesting, was what it is that corporations can do to advance the economic empowerment of women. And one of the new areas that they focused on was on corporate procurement. The procurement market is up to, the estimates are, it's about a $12 trillion spend annually. So it's a huge spend.
Just on procurement. This is buying, we're talking about buying desks, newspaper, cars, whatever,
the whole gamut of things.
that a company would use.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we're in a studio, so it's about the chairs we're sitting on, the paint on the walls, the lights. So it's about, so the question that I would ask your viewers to consider would be, ask your procurement officer tomorrow, what percentage of goods and services are we buying from companies owned by women? Now that's a really interesting question. Firstly, because most companies can't answer, and then research shows that currently women-owned enterprises are only accessing about 1% of that huge purchase. Like I said, it's about $12 trillion globally, and the UN procurement, for example, that in itself is 16 billion annually. So it's a huge spend. And for governments in that, governments typically spend, it's about 15 to 30% of GDP on anything. Of course, it's about investing in buying schools and building schools, hospitals and roads. There's that. It's also events. Governments run a lot of events. That's catering and flowers and graphic design and all of those sorts of industries that women traditionally do are actually in. So what it is, you have a spend as a government, for example, or as a corporation. So what this is, it's a fiscally responsible way of investing in women's economic empowerment. You're spending this money anyway, you know what I mean? So have a look at who's benefiting from this, because money that goes into the hands of women business owners tend to employ more women, and that puts more money in the hands of more women. And the research shows that women spend more money on the health and education of children. So this is a way to break into generational poverty.
Now, women participate in various societies at differing levels, varying degrees, and it's across the board, from A to Z, I should say. But what do you find, just in a generic sense, what are some of the obstacles to women being able to participate? Are these cultural obstacles? In some societies, it's very difficult for women to be involved in professional activities, political activities, other educational activities. But what are some of the main obstacles confronting them, just in a generic sense?
Well, as you said, Bill, there's a whole range of obstacles, some of which can be legislated for, and others which really have to do with changing social norms and attitudes. We're in the United States, as you know, this is one of the few industrialized countries that doesn't have a paid maternity leave. It doesn't have that in law, that companies and others must actually pay women who are taking maternity leave. And so this is, even for women who are able to access the employment market, in terms of security of your job, you're always on tenterhooks. If there's no paid maternity leaves, then chances are once you do fall pregnant, you might be pushed out. And I had somebody in my office this morning giving me statistics from some companies, some countries in Europe and other places where it's really it's an egregious violation of women's human rights, their right to work. So there's that. But then on the other side, we need to think about in the home attitudes to women working. I mean, there have been improvements in many companies around the world. We do see women's participation rates in the labour market. Actually, I'd like to be able to say increasing, but actually they're stagnating. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that? Why are the rates of women participating in the labour market actually stagnating? And again, I think it has to do with, and the Secretary General, the report of the Secretary General's high-level panel, Women's Economic Empowerment, attests to this. A lot of that is about gender stereotyping. There still is concept of men's work, women's work, who should stay home and look after the children. It's intergenerational. It's what your grandparents think. It's what your parents think. It's what you think. But then it's also about the social structures that are or are not in place to support women returning to the workforce. And that gets you get down to childcare, you get down to those kinds of really seemingly intransigent issues as well.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a community access television station, PBS station, or perhaps a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please do. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service. Today we're talking with Ms. Meg Jones of UN Women about the role of women and some of the obstacles that they confront and what can be done to provide assistance to women to empower them. Meg Jones, we're right in the middle of it, and we want to stay on this topic.
Sure.
This is a difficult issue in some countries not quite as difficult, not quite as problematic, shall we say. But do you find that there's more of an open-minded approach today in the majority of places around the world to focusing on the talent that women have and the key role that they can play if given the opportunity to do so, and especially when it comes to businesses?
Yeah.
Are they more involved today than they were, say, maybe 15 years ago?
Bill, I think that there's an increase. You see a gradual increase in the number of women on boards, for example. In some places in the UN system, we have an initiative to advance women within the UN system itself. But I think we really have to be sensitive to the prevailing stereotypes that are out there. I mean, if you think of women on the move, like as you know here, we've had a summit on the large movement of refugees and migrants. And when we think about the work that migrant women do, for example, there are 244 million migrants in the world today. About half of them are women, but they're relegated to the lower paid jobs. Again, that gender stereotyping kicks in. You know, there's the nannies, the domestic workers, this kind of thing. And much of that work is poorly regulated, poorly paid, poorly recognised. So within the UN system, and our executive director in particular, one of her initiatives under the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment is to encourage countries to sign on and ratify the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, for example, to better protect their rights. And there's many reasons why we'd want to do this. I know that there's this prevailing push towards xenophobia. We think of migrants, we think of, but actually, you know what? Migrants, last year, migrants remitted $496 billion. They sent that money home. And when we're thinking about peace, I mean, there is a link to peace and stability in there. If we're looking at peace and stability back home, we do need to create jobs and generate incomes in sending countries. At the same time, these remittances actually play a role in stability in those families and in those communities. And when migrant women go back, they take a lot of those skills with them as well. I think what we need to do is change our attitude to the work that migrant women can do. There's no need to relegate them to domestic workers and nannies, really. We need to also consider the movement of highly skilled women as well. Granting visas, creating those kinds of opportunities, and recognising the talents and the growth in the communities when these women take those skills back.
Do you have operating principles? Do you have women's empowerment principles or anything like that?
Yeah, we do.
That can be brought to bear to help people realize perhaps the talent that women have, the untapped potential that's there?
Yeah, we do. We have 1,400 companies that have signed on to the Women's Empowerment Principles. This is specifically for corporations. And these are corporations that they make a commitment to non-discrimination in the workplace. That gets back down to what I was saying before about the hiring and promotion of women. It is about maternity benefits and leave, those kinds of aspects. It's also looking at procurement. It's looking at your value chain. It is looking at the current level of sourcing of goods and services from companies owned by women as a means of encouraging the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises. As I said before, it's SMEs that are responsible for about 80% of employment today. So if we want to see jobs generated, we have to invest in the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises. And the way to do that, as I said, with women-owned enterprises, is they're winning so much of the business, so little of that large pool of procurement contracts. We really need to skill them up to be able to understand procurement and to win those contracts. So we have a flagship program on that at UN Women. We have a manual for companies. I thought I'd bring that one in actually because I know that you're going to have a lot of companies out there that are interested. It's the power of procurement, how to source from companies owned by women.
Can they go to unwomen.org and tap into that?
Yeah,
so just go to unwomen.org.
And procurement, and this will come up. It's for companies to better understand what they can do. And this is about like breaking down contract size, not one contract for $1 million, but perhaps 10 contracts for 100,000 to allow SMEs to better access those opportunities as one example of how to do that. And I've got, when we close out, I want to just do a bit of a commercial for an upcoming meeting that we have that your viewers might be interested in participating in that context.
Okay, and it doesn't matter when this program airs. It could be before the meeting or after the meeting, but
ongoing work.
They can go back and tap into your site or they can Google it, so that's not a problem.
Exactly.
You've got, I'm sure, many programs in the pipeline right now. The one that I remember that I saw is Women in STEAM, STEAM.
Yeah.
What is women in STEAM?
Well, it's science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. And this
you
is,
added
of
the
course,
A for STEM. Okay,
yeah, we got
STEAM.
that, yeah,
Got
STEAM.
it. Okay.
So these are obviously the industries of today and of the future. So if you're thinking about robotics and automation, for example, we need to prepare our young people today, and actually those who are looking at mid-career changes, because as you know, we're living longer, working longer. So these skills are 21st century skills. We need to ensure that women are setting themselves up for success in the changing world of work. And we looked at this at CSW 61. That was the Commission on the Status of Women.
Okay.
Yeah, the Commission on the Status of
Right.
Women. We looked specifically at women in the changing world of work and identified some of these hot areas of the future and the need to build the skills of women now. Now, it's not just the skills of women in developed countries. Of course, we need to pay particular attention to building the skills of women in developing countries as well. So in that context at UN Women, we're developing a program right now to work more closely with the G7 and the G20. They have commitments not only to close the labour force participation rate gap of women by 25% by 2025, but also to increase spending on technical, vocational education and training, which is your STEAM, by a third in developing countries as well. So we should see some money coming down there to actually support that, because commitments are made, but then where's the money coming from? Yeah. So UN Women is working with G7, G20 on science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths in the context of their commitment to increase funding on technical, vocational education and training for the jobs for the future.
As you look at, you've been in this business for several years now. You know exactly what's going on. As you look at the situations unfolding around the world, you look at the factors that are in place, the people you're working with, some of the challenges. What do you see as the major challenge to help better prepare women, to empower women so that they can play a more positive role in any society, be it a developing country or a developed country or wherever it may be? Is there one particular challenge that's out there? I'm sure there are many, such as funding, education, what have you, but is there one that we might want to focus upon over as far as the number one priority?
I think our basic humanity is an important element to remember. It's getting lost. There was the push towards globalization. Now there's a swing towards nationalism. We were experiencing multiculturalism in many countries, and now again we're getting back to this. We're swinging back towards xenophobia. And this is a threat not only to women but to world peace. There's no doubt about that. And so I think that what we really need to concentrate on is when we think about the economic empowerment of women, it's not just women in our own countries. We're too closely connected now, We need to be thinking about the global good. And in that context, if you want to tackle the fundamental factors, we really need to be thinking about job creation, income generation, Now, the thing about the economic empowerment of women is that the statistics show that well-educated women who earn money that spend on the health and education of their children raise children who are better positioned to work, When young men and young girls around the world are gainfully employed, they're able to look after themselves, their family, their community, they don't want to pick up a gun, you know what I mean? Statistics show that. I've worked in trade. Before I worked at UN Women, I worked in trade for 10 years. And like that too, I mean, the politicians at the top level might be wanting to throw bombs at each other, but really it's the business community that says, hang on a minute, whoa. And I could give you 100 examples of border towns. I won't mention any countries on this particular program, but they are the ones that go to the government and say, don't do it. Do you know what this will do to our economy if you do that? Do you know what that will do to our families if we lose those contracts? I think this is the thing about international trade. It brings us closer together. And it's a way of creating jobs. When I was talking before about the women's empowerment principles, those 1,400 companies that have signed on, they don't have value chains, they have global value chains. They source from all over the world. So if, for example, they make a commitment to increasing sourcing their coffee, and all companies buy coffee, from women-owned enterprises in Africa, then you're creating jobs, for example, for women in Burundi, which will lead to the stabilization of peace in that country as well. And that is a project I did work on, and we do see that in that country as a case in point.
Well, Meg Jones, Chief of the Women's Empowerment Section of the UN Women, this is such an important topic, and it's one that we need to hear more about, we need to learn more about it, and we need to participate in helping to break down the barriers that have held women out in many societies. I guess there's no actual society in the world that's actually barrier-free, but it's a really important topic. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.